Stop the world!
I think there's really a need to go back to first principles in some ways. Why do these things matter?
Welcome to this week's episode of the ASPI podcast, Stop the World. I'm Justin Bassey.
And I'm David Rowe.
We're just a couple of days away from the start of this year's United Nations General Assembly Leaders Week. And joining us today on the podcast is Lisa Sharland, Senior Fellow and Director of the Protecting Civilians and Human Security Program at the Stimson Centre. Lisa is, of course, also a Senior Fellow here at ASPI.
That's right, Justin. Lisa speaks with Olivia Nelson about the UN and how the multilateral system is adapting, or in many cases struggling to adapt, to rapid global change. They discuss the Summit of the Future, which is kicking off later today in New York and which aims to find some kind of new international consensus around pressing global issues. I understand that might invite some scepticism, but what I like about this discussion, Justin, is that it's very much grounded in reality.
Very much so. The prospects for UN reform seem perhaps more distant than they have ever been, but Lisa highlights that there are small and quite practical changes that might bolster support for multilateralism and put us on a better footing to tackle the harder stuff.
Indeed. Lisa makes the important point that the UN is precisely as strong as the sum of its parts, and therefore throwing your hands in the air isn't terribly helpful, which I understand. They also talk about peacekeeping, the role for a country like Australia, and interestingly, the growing role of air power in peacekeeping, which I must say is something I hadn't really thought about myself.
In addition to the deployments that Australia has, there's a lot of work that happens regionally with training and capacity building, working with partners, as well as supporting policy and research as well.
Olivia and Lisa also talk about the challenges women continue to face in multilateral settings and how gender equality and women's security relates to broader national and international security.
I think recognising that understanding women's perceptions of their security, the impact that decisions around sexual and reproductive health have on the ability of women to serve and work in certain organisations has flow-on effects to these things. All these things are linked.
And finally, as ASPI celebrates the 10-year anniversary of its Women in Defence and Security Network, Olivia and Lisa talk about the evolving presence and contribution of women in Australia's national security landscape. And just to mention that Lisa was instrumental in helping to build the network in its early days, and Olivia leads on organising the network today.
Making sure that we have that diversity represented in the way that national security occurs, both in terms of women's participation, but diverse women and men in all their representations is really, really critical.
And just to note that this discussion was actually recorded in July, which just shows, Dave, how hectic our podcast schedule has been.
Indeed, I've been feeling every bit of it. So we'll shut up for now and hand over to Olivia and Lisa.
Lisa Sharland, Senior Fellow and Director of the Protecting Civilians and Human Security Program at the Stimson Centre, and Senior ASPI Fellow. Welcome to the new ASPI podcast, Stop the World.
It's great to be here, Liv.
It's great to have you back at ASPI in Canberra and on the new ASPI podcast. Prior to joining the Stimson Centre, you were actually Deputy Director of ASPI's Defence Strategy Program, and you also played a key role in ASPI's Women in Defence and Security Network, both roles for which you've laid excellent groundwork and mentoring for those that have followed. Today I'm keen to discuss a range of geopolitical issues with you, ranging from peacekeeping to multilateralism, the UN system and gender equality. But to start off, can I ask you to tell me a little bit about your role at Stimson?
No, thanks for having me, Liv. So I've now been at Stimson, I think, nearly 3 years. And so for those that may not be aware, the Stimson Centre is an independent think tank in Washington, D.C. We're marking 35 years. So we were established in the twilight of the Cold War.
Older than us.
Yes, no, exactly. But close, or somewhat close. And so the program that I lead, the Protecting Civilians and Human Security Program, is one of many different sort of thematic and regional programs that we have at Stimson. So we're a team of 3, and we look at how to strengthen the tools and mechanisms and responses to protecting civilians in conflict settings and strengthening human rights. And so we work on a range of different issues related to, at the moment, we have projects looking at the impact of mis and disinformation on civilians where UN peacekeeping missions are deployed, through to the role of gender-responsive leadership in UN peace operations. So it's a really interesting field of work to be in.
Yeah, definitely. So you're based in DC and the US is currently gearing up for presidential elections, which I'm sure is all you're hearing about at the moment. But within the UN system, there is a fear that a Trump presidency will lead to a withdrawal of US support for the UN. And I'd like to come back to this challenge a little bit later. But I'm interested in your views on how we've got to where we currently are. If we focus too much on Trump, for example, is there a risk that the causes of the problems are overlooked? And in the case of challenges for the multilateral system, they existed long before Trump. So could you take us through what you think has happened to see so many people, whether in democracies or in the global south, lose some trust in international institutions and the role of multilateralism, particularly since the end of the Cold War?
Look, I think there's a range of different factors to take into consideration. I think first and foremost, it's really important to remember that we are nearly 80 years on from when the UN was established after the end of World War II. That's quite a significant amount of time. And the world has changed significantly then, whether you look at technology, the way governments are structured, even the number of countries that have gone through decolonisation processes. So we've seen this immense amount of change over the last 80 years. And while the UN has adapted to some extent and we have seen reform, I think there is a real friction there that there hasn't quite been enough to keep up with that change. So we see this, for instance, around the tensions and conversations around UN Security Council reform, for example, and how reflective that is of the world that we have today and the different sort of roles that countries play. We have, quite legitimately a lot of questions from countries that we tend to collectively call the global south in terms of the way that they engage in the system and how representative it is of their views as well. So I think putting it in that context when we consider where the UN and the multilateral system is a really sort of important starting point for where we are and some of the tensions that we see. So that call for reform is really strong at the moment. One of the big things, of course, that's taking place this year is the Summit for the Future in September. This idea that there'll be a pact for the future to look collectively at how the organisation can address some of the challenges that we see emerging. But the UN is not necessarily the most nimble organisation. And so that sets up a range of challenges. And I think when you have a series of different disruptions happen, so we've seen over the last few years, COVID, for instance, was a huge disruption globally. We see increasing security tensions. We see conflict. If, for example, you reflect on the fact that the state of protection of civilians in conflict at the moment is incredibly dire. The latest Secretary General's report, for instance, reflects the fact that in 2023 there are over 33,000 civilian deaths in conflict. This is a 72% increase on the year before. So when you consider some of these factors that the multilateral system is grappling with at the moment, there are a range of immense challenges that it is attempting to deal with. So to go back to your point at the beginning about, to what extent has or is Trump likely to have, should he come back into office, and an impact on the multilateral system and some of these challenges that it faces. We saw disruption under the previous Trump administration. We saw the US government withdrawing from different UN bodies and entities. And so I think there is a genuine concern that there will be a similar level of disruption, if not more, that kind of plays out in this context that the UN and the multilateral system is trying to grapple with at the moment.
72%, that's not a small increase. Can I ask you to kind of expand on some of the things you just raised and maybe kind of go bigger picture? What are your views on the current state of multilateralism? So you've gone into some of those trends, but what are the most concerning trends that you're seeing, and are there any positive developments?
Well, there's quite a few, alarming trends and concerning trends to point out. I think definitely if you look in the human rights space and some of the pushback that we've seen in different UN bodies around sort of just the general consensus around some of the issues that we've seen on human rights, even to the extent of sort of conversations around women and gender, there are areas there where I think there are particular sort of thoughts and concerns about the pushback. And one of the implications of this, if you take the women, peace and security agenda, for instance, is there is a hesitancy or understanding if there are efforts to sort of open up or push for more sort of normative agreement on issues, that there will be a real battle around some of those issues. Now, on the one hand, that is quite concerning. On the other, I think it really draws attention to the fact that we also need to be focusing on implementation of a lot of these normative commitments that have been made. And that is challenging when you have a different level of commitment from different governments to some of these issues as well. And I think if you have administrations or governments that have traditionally been supporters of some of these issues, to take, for example, the US, if there's wavering, then that can potentially create some fractures in terms of sort of progressing those issues. Look, I would say if you want to look at a more positive note on some of these issues, at the end of the day, you still have countries putting up their hand to want to serve on the UN Security Council and various UN bodies that want to engage, that want to take part and advocate for certain issues. There is a real sort of active support around the importance of prevention and how the UN can support those efforts, even on development, despite the fact that progress is not where it should be at the moment. So I think you can still see that interest and level of desire, I think, to contribute to the system. But I will say it tends to vary depending on the different political administrations that countries have in place at the moment.
And how do you see strategic competition playing out in the UN system with, a range of countries vying for influence across the globe? How can we counter this in the UN system, and what are you seeing there?
So I think first and foremost, to go back to my first point around the fact that it's 80 years since we had the establishment of the UN, I think there's really a need to go back to first principles in some ways. Why do these things matter? It sounds so basic to say it, but we undertook a research project 2 years ago looking at efforts to implement commitments that have been made in the multilateral system on human rights and what governments were doing at the national level to do that. And one of the things we found in talking to a number of different government stakeholders and civil society organisations that were working in the human rights space is that there was a general lack of awareness in many contexts about what commitments have been made within the UN system, why they matter, even how they're translated into local languages. And now that sounds like such a basic thing, but I think, for governments, for political leaders, working with civil society, making sure there isn't that closure of civil space, that is really fundamental, I think, to sort of backstopping potentially some of the slide around support for multilateralism more broadly and some of these commitments that have been made. I think the second point I'd make is, making sure that we dispel any misconceptions around some of these issues. Sort of a general pushback is often, the UN and its bureaucracy is going to impinge on our sort of sovereignty and all these sort of problems. And to be honest, the UN doesn't have that much power when it comes to these things. So it's an imperfect system. But I think at the end of the day, it's actually, looking to what it does and dispelling some of those myths. It's also the sum of its parts. It's the sum of member states. The Secretariat and those that work in it are guided by sort of the political commitments and consensus that gets reached. So I think there's a need to be careful when we say the UN or we refer to a particular entity. What are we actually talking about there and what does that mean? If you look at the Australian context, you go back to October 2019, we had Prime Minister Morrison here talk about negative globalism and commission an audit on sort of, the state of global institutions and Australia's engagement. And interestingly, despite some of the pessimism in that initial sort of commissioning of that study, what the study found when the Department of Foreign Affairs looked into it and what we heard from Foreign Minister Payne at the time was that there was real benefit to leaning into the system and, making sure that we support and uphold those institutions. So I think that speaks to the fact that there is sort of a real value there. I mean, certainly, to sort of a final point here, there is a real politic argument, I guess, around sort of what the strategic interests are of different countries here, how influential they are on the system, how they want to shape it. That is something that comes up time and time again. And it does tend to play to, I guess, an audience that isn't that interested in multilateralism. I will say, if you want to draw the attention of someone to why multilateralism matters, if you start talking about geostrategic interests and the engagement of particular countries in that system and how they may not align with interests, then you do actually start to get a captive audience. So I think first and foremost, I'd certainly be saying, the organisation there contributes to a lot of these things, whether it's human rights and other things. But I think we also need to be cognizant of the audience we're talking to and why it matters to actually still be engaged in the system and defend some of those strategic interests as well.
We've also discussed this actually. I was recently in Geneva and I was struck by almost a sense of fatalism that from many people in Geneva that either there was nothing needed to be reformed in some of these institutions, whether it be the WTO or other kind of UN institutions that we visited, or that reform was simply impossible, so it's not worth trying. Do you think that reform of some of these organisations is possible? You've worked on the UN for such a long time that you've probably heard the term UN Security Council reform many, many times. But do you think it's possible?
I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, the UN has reformed in the past. I think, you've seen the Security Council expand in size. You've seen the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission. You've seen the way that different committees work evolve. And there's a whole host of different examples there. And a lot of it isn't necessarily at the structural level. A lot of it is in terms of working methods that, to be quite honest, people will not see in their day-to-day work, whether it's the way the council consults or it engages with civil society. So you do see that spectrum of reform. The challenge at the moment is I think we see such a significant degree of division and polarisation that finding that middle ground for consensus on things is much more challenging. And to take the example of UN Security Council reform, you have had a US administration that is much more open to engaging in conversations around what that may look like. But you also have multiple different proposals on the table. And again, in the context of any sort of political discussion, when you have so many options to choose from, trying to narrow that field becomes very, very challenging. And of course, any country that has a particular power is not going to want to relinquish it. So I think there is an appetite to recognise that reform is needed in these situations. It's about, well, what does that reform look like? And how do you make sure that you get the most countries on board? And it is a bit of a different moment now to perhaps what it might have been 30 or 40 years ago to do that. that. It's not impossible, but I think it is much more challenging than it used to be.
To dive a little deeper into the UN system, I'd like to focus on peacekeeping. It's a major focus of your work at the Stimson Centre. And at a roundtable at ASPI, you spoke about the future of UN peacekeeping in light of the evolving nature of conflict. What are the challenges that UN peacekeeping missions are currently facing, and how can they adapt to enable future success? What role can a country like Australia, for example, play in strengthening peace operations?
So it's a good point to start out to think about what peacekeeping actually does. I appreciate this is not something that people work on day to day like we might do in the work that we do. At the moment, the UN has deployed 11 peacekeeping operations in country contexts ranging from South Sudan and the Central African Republic through to Lebanon, through to Cyprus. And all those different missions have very different mandates. And you have more than 70,000 personnel, military, police and civilian deployed, and a budget at the moment of just over $5 billion to support that. So to start with, peacekeeping tends to be quite cost effective when you compare it to other types of military or civil military interventions that take place. Australia, of course, at the moment has personnel deployed in the UN Truce Supervision Organisation in the Middle East, as well as the UN mission in South Sudan. So Australia has a very modest footprint in terms of its peacekeeping contributions, but it's important to acknowledge there, I think, in addition to the deployments that Australia has, there's a lot of work that happens regionally with training and capacity building, working with partners, as well as supporting policy and research as well, which is somewhere where we've been able to engage from Stimson's standpoint. In terms of challenges at the moment, one of the key things that we see playing out is these types of missions deploy with the consent of the host authorities to come into the country. Well, actually, the three principles are consent of the parties to the conflict, impartiality, and non-use of force except in self-defence or defence of the mandate. Now, in practice, consent often means consent of the host government where the mission is deployed. And so to take an example, last year, the mission that had been deployed for 10 years in Mali, the government very abruptly asked the mission to leave. It withdrew its consent. And this has sort of, I think, raised some more general concerns. We're seeing a transition process as the mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is starting to leave after 25 years as well, in terms of what that means for UN peacekeeping as a tool and sort of what its comparative advantages are. There is a preference in the case of Mali, for instance, and even the DRC to some extent, to approach different security actors to come in and address the security or insecurity they've had in the country for a very long time. So in Eastern DRC at the moment, last year you had a regional force through the East Africa community deploy to Eastern DRC in an effort to address the conflict and the threat from armed groups. At the moment, you have a South African Development Community Force that's deployed there, attempting to do that alongside the UN mission. So that just gives you a sense, I think, of the complexity and the fact that a number of these missions have been deployed for over a decade, if not longer. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't been successful in preventing the escalation or outbreak of conflict. If you look at the missions in the Middle East, they've had a real de-escalation contribution to what's going there. Cyprus has been monitoring a buffer zone for 40 plus years. In the case of these bigger multidimensional missions that are there supporting reform of the security sector, a rule of law institutions, protecting civilians, working with the government, it is very complex. And one of the sort of broader trends here is that the mission tends to get caught up a little bit in the domestic politics of the country as well. And it's very easy then to point to the mission and say, you've been here for 20 plus years. What have you done and why haven't you fixed the security problem? So even though there is research and evidence that says, where peacekeeping missions are deployed contributes to a decrease in civilian deaths and various other things. It does, if you look at sort of the counterfactual, what happens if a mission leaves, you're probably likely to see an increased threat to civilians. So these are some of the tensions that are playing out with peacekeeping at the moment. You add in the geopolitical divisions in the council and you add in some of the wider dynamics at the moment around the role that the African Union, for instance, is taking in terms of leading missions like the one it has in Somalia. And so there's a very broad conversation taking place right now about the future of these types of operations and what that sort of means going forward. So that's actively happening in New York. Next year, there will be another peacekeeping ministerial that Germany's leading. And there are a lot of conversations around sort of seizing the Secretary General's recommendation for more nimble and adaptable missions that will be deployed in the future. So to very quickly come back to your question, well, what does this mean for Australia? I think it means continuing to assess where it makes sense and it aligns with Australia's interest to deploy personnel, We have the ADF deployed at the moment, but the AFP, which has been a huge contributor to peacekeeping over the last sort of 70 years, currently doesn't have any police peacekeepers deployed to the UN. And I think that is a significant gap given the need in many of these contexts. Training and capacity building, working with countries like Fiji and Vietnam and many others in this space. And then similarly, the policy engagement. And I think this does sort of prompt a broader question about sort of some of the partnerships and cooperation Australia also has working with the African Union and a number of the countries deploying there going forward as well, as sort of the gravity of these conversations tends to focus on the African continent as well.
So lots of opportunities there.
Quite a few, yeah.
Staying on peacekeeping, you recently released a report on the role of air power in UN peacekeeping operations. Can you talk us through the importance of the air domain to peacekeeping and some of your key findings from your report?
So we published this report in April. And the report was co-authored with Jarrell Pendlebury and Philip Champion, in addition to a lot of support and input that we had from a number of other stakeholders. And I guess just to highlight a couple of the findings from the report and why we did it. I think, first of all, and this was something driven by the UN military advisor in New York and others, was a recognition that the threat environment where UN peacekeeping missions are deployed at the moment is rapidly evolving. And if you look at the context where they're deployed, for instance, you may see the use of commercial UAS systems that are sort of, overflying bases where missions are deployed. If you look, to other conflict settings, Ukraine is a very good example where you see a complete sort of revolution happening in the way that the air domain is being used, and the fact that non-state actors have access to these platforms which can disrupt platforms or sort of aircraft where governments have invested heavily in them just through the use of small commercial drones that may be armed. So these types of changes, what might be effectively referred to as sort of this more democratization of sort of the air domain and the access to sort of these different offensive tools, is likely to have a huge impact on UN peacekeeping going forward. So first and foremost, we wanted to sort of set out how the threat environment has evolved and changed. The second then was to sort of recommend a more coherent approach to this. Many national militaries will have an air power concept that guides the way that they approach sort of the air domain. So in the context of UN peacekeeping, we sort of built on that and set out sort of three roles in that setting: mobility, situational awareness, and response, and tied that back specifically to the types of mandates that UN peacekeeping has. So to protect civilians, to observe, monitor, report, to support peace-building tasks, and to work with other regional partners as well. And then I think finally, with this evolution that we're seeing in peacekeeping at the moment and the work with a range of different partner entities that may be deployed, we thought it was important to prompt conversation about the role and contribution that the UN has in the air domain as part of these partnerships. And we see this, for instance, at the moment there is a debate about the mission deployed in Eastern DRC and the type of logistical support it might offer to the regional mission that's deployed there at the moment. So there's lots of different questions there, and by having a more coherent approach to looking at sort of more comprehensive policies on sort of, counter systems to address UAS platforms and a whole host of things, there could be a little bit more coherence to address some of the gaps that we've seen in terms of UN peacekeeping in that space.
Important work that's helping the UN evolve.
Yeah, well, that's the aim at the end of the day. And I think to get member states and the UN Secretariat just to have a little bit more space to think about creatively, because to be really honest, UN peacekeeping, a lot of the entities it's a 20th century tool trying to adapt to the 21st century. And part of that is going to be the evolution we see in the air domain.
Great. You mentioned pushback earlier against gender equality and WPS initiatives, and I'd like to come back to that. Unfortunately, this doesn't feel unique to the UN system. While we have in recent decades seen some significant progress on women's rights in many areas, including in Australia, the trend is not clear globally, with a mix of authoritarian regimes from Russia and Iran to the Taliban removing hard-won individual rights, along with populist leaders in democracies fueling divisions on rights-related issues, including gender. So what are your reflections on this? How can we continue to advocate for gender equality globally while not feeding into the narratives of both the external and internal forces seeking to undermine our societies? An easy question, sorry.
No. Well, look, and I think this is something that we're certainly grappling with in a domestic context, whether it be in the US, Australia, or a lot of countries. I think, how do we sort of make sure that this isn't just sort of an us versus them conversation in terms of sort of women's rights and why it matters? So I think, I was reminded the other day in conversation, when you bring up the fact that a couple of decades ago, women, when they got married, had to leave the public service, or these types of things. And you realise that history may not be well known. The fact that women did not have a lot of these rights. And that's why we have these campaigns to bring about gender equality, to address that imbalance that has been historic and structural. And so I think sometimes we jump to this is the solution we need, without actually laying out what the problem is at the outset. So I think actually having a conversation about why that has been problematic and what implications that has for the types of roles and rights that women have is really important. It's not going to get the entire audience, but I think particularly if you were talking to younger generations here, that can be really important in trying to bring people along. And that brings me to the second point that you hinted at there, Liv, about how we frame this conversation for different types of audiences. It's not to say that you're making a different argument or a different point, but people are often going to be receptive to different points. So in some instances, I would make the case that absolutely, gender equality and women's rights are human rights, those types of things. But if you are talking to individuals working in a very operational organisation who may not seize upon that point, then often you have to point out what contribution that might make at the end of the day to their effectiveness, whether it be defence or any other type of organisation. So I think having a range of tools in our toolbox to be able to talk broadly about these issues. I mean, I know one of the things we discussed yesterday was even the use of the terminology feminist foreign policy. There are differing approaches on that. Again, Australia has taken a different approach to how it frames its approach to gender equality internationally and nationally. Again, recognising that some of these certain terms have the ability to be divisive. Now, that's not to say we should shy away from using them in conversational things, but I think it means we need to think really creatively about how we engage on some of these issues. And the final point related to that, I think I'd also make, is to ensure that we're moving away from efforts that might effectively just tick the box on some of these things. It can often be very easy to sort of say, great, gender parity has been reached. We've got 50% women here in these particular roles. And then when you dig a little bit further and you look in the organisation, you might realise that the retention isn't that great, or you immediately start to have some rollback on things. And so I think making sure there's accountability mechanisms, but we're also looking more holistically at some of these issues and the types of roles and the meaningful contribution that women make in these situations is really, really important. So I think there's sort of a few areas there in terms of the pushback, but I will say it is quite a concerning setting at the moment in terms of some of the developments. It's somewhat easy to say that sitting here in a context like Australia, while also recognising that we have a huge conversation underway at the moment about the domestic violence crisis and women's perceptions of security. And I think if you'll give me a minute, I think a lot of these issues tie in directly to the way that we approach national security more broadly. It requires a much sort of bolder conversation on some of these issues. It started to happen and open up a little bit during COVID. And I think recognising that understanding women's perceptions of their security, the impact that decisions around sexual and reproductive health have on the ability of women to serve and work in certain organisations has flow-on effects to these things. All these things are linked. So I think it's really critical to make sure that there's that holistic approach to addressing it, and then slowly work with those that may not be on board to sort of talk about the value and how that can actually enhance their own security as well.
A lot of things to take away, so thank you. But the importance of messaging, I think, is a really critical one. It's a complex topic, and I think we could talk for hours. But I don't want to wrap up without asking you about ASPI's Women in Defence and Security Network. You played a huge role in the network during your time at ASPI. And this year we're celebrating its 10th anniversary. I'm pleased to say it's still going strong, and our conversation only shows the ongoing need for such initiatives. What are your reflections on how things have changed or not changed for women in national security, and where initiatives like the WDSN, we're definitely not the only one and there's many great initiatives out there, but where should we focus our efforts going forward?
So it was a real privilege to be part of that while at ASPI, and there are a number of people involved in sort of setting that up and establishing that, and huge credit to them, I think, for having the vision to do that. Look, I think certainly to reflect back on the last 10 years, I think the most visible thing is we have certainly seen, I think, the presence and contribution of women across the national security sector here in Canberra sort of evolve. We've seen real visible appointments within defence and other organisations, which is really promising. We've seen different gender equality strategies put in place and approaches to diversity more broadly. So I think we've seen some real recognition and progress in that space. I think in terms of WDSN, for me personally, a lot of the value of the speed mentoring events that took place and other initiatives was, I think, highlighting and raising awareness that there are experts that can look different and have different views on these issues. And I think that was really critical because so often there is a tendency to sort of see that model of whether it sort of be the middle-aged white male who might be contributing to the discussions as the authoritative voice on some of these issues and allowing those that may not look that way to sort of be undermined in their contribution. So I think it just highlighted the fact that there are women contributing in this space that have a lot of expertise and authority to bring to the conversations. And I think one of the other things that I valued out of a lot of those conversations is a lot of them are one-on-one or in small groups in some instances. And that provided a setting where people could actually acknowledge, you know what, my career might look great on the surface, but there are actually a lot of setbacks. I got rejected from jobs. I didn't get interviews. And actually having a really frank conversation around that and the realities of care responsibilities, I think that creates a more open space more broadly within the sort of the national security community to realise that these things have an impact on the way that we do our work and the way that we perceive our jobs and our contribution. So, and the final point I'll make on that is I think also the value of ensuring that men were taking part in a lot of these conversations as well, and that you saw a lot of advocates and those who were interested in understanding the challenges and problems. So I think they would be a few reflections sort of looking back. And I think looking forward, I think definitely, and I know this is something WDSN is doing, but building on the work that has happened there, you know, looking more broadly at the diversity and inclusion piece and making sure that we have that diversity represented in the way that national security occurs, both in terms of women's participation, but diverse women and men in all their representations is really, really critical. And I have no doubt that that's going to continue as WDSN moves forward beyond its 10 years.
Yes, I should highlight that WDSN, whilst it is a network for women, we welcome everyone and encourage participation from all, because the idea is that, like you said, we're building up hopefully as well the expertise of the next generation and allowing them to build their networks too. So welcome advice, and thank you for all of the work you've done for WDSN before me and others here at ASPI. We really, really, really appreciate it. I'm going to finish with one quick question that we like to ask our expert guests, and that is a book recommendation. Is there anything that's inspired you and that you would suggest our listeners go out and read?
That's a very long list to come with a short one. So it's going to be some things that I've been reading in the last couple of months. I guess two that I'd probably highlight off the top of my head. One is I was reading the book by Clarissa Ward, On All Fronts. So she's a journalist reporting on her career and her experiences working within the media environment and working in very challenging situations from the Middle East through to Afghanistan and a range of contexts. And then I think the other one, to go to some of the topics that we were talking about, Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, sort of unpacks data biases that we see across the world that we may not think about and the impact that that has on the way we go about our lives. And it was just a really insightful book, I think, to understand everything from the way our cities are designed to the way we go about our daily lives, and just realising that there are some things that we still need to tackle to make sure that we have more gender equality.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, I encourage all of our listeners to go out and grab those books. Lisa, thank you so much for your time, for visiting us in Canberra, and please come back soon.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be back.
That's all we have for you this week on Stop the World. If you have any feedback on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you at podcast@aspi.org.au.
And be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.